Hello, welcome to Haman Nature. I am Adam Haman, and I have another great conversation with Bob Murphy for you. In this one, we tackle the theory of evolution and also simulation theory, and I can't wait for you to discover how those two things are related. This one is a lot of fun. Enjoy.
Haman Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Haman.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, Adam.
Bob, serious question.
Yeah.
And please tell me the truth. If this is all a simulation and I was just a non player character, you'd let me know, right?
I mean, I could type it in and then you'd give me an answer, but really, what's the point?
I'd probably just try and sell you gear and
Yeah.
trade in your your extraneous supply items, just like we always do, Prospector Bob.
I want to get one of those swords that like it shoots out. The Legend of Zelda, those are my favorite.
Oh yeah, it's a good
weapon.
one. The Master Sword.
All right. So, as often happens in these, my Twitter battles are going to provide the fodder for today's conversation, folks.
Indeed.
I'll jump right in, and Adam's opening joke is relevant. So, the story, Adam, the background for the good folks at home is minding my own business, scrolling through Twitter, and then I see it was from Science account, I believe, or it might have even been narrowly focused to Carl Sagan's legacy. I can't remember, but in any event, it showed, it was like a clip going into some video presentation by Mr. Sagan, and it attributed a view to him. Now, in fairness, I want to say I don't know whether this is a literal quote, so I'm not here like beating up on Carl's. Like I'm beating up on the notion that was attributed to him, perhaps unfairly, or perhaps the person generalized or something and said something that was less nuanced than what he said in the video. But in any event, this official Twitter account that had a lot of followers and a lot of hearts on this thing, the view it attributed to him said, evolution is no longer a theory, it's a fact. And so I thought, people know in my background, I disagree with that, and I think that's one of the things that irks me, and we can get into this, Adam, about the overconfidence where people will say things like, evolution is as firmly established as gravity, stuff like that. And we can talk about it in a minute, but for our purposes today here, just to get the ball rolling and to tie into what Adam's opening joke was, so I retweeted that, and my comment was, yes, but also, and then in quotation marks, hey, wouldn't it be, isn't it cool that we might live in a simulation? That's crazy, or something like that. Okay, and then I just let it rip. And as often happens with my tweets like that, a lot of people misunderstood my point. So let me just stay at the outset. My point was, there are many people alive today for whom this is true, that on the one hand, they would heartily endorse that statement that, yeah, the theory of evolution, or sorry, I just misspoke. Evolution in the Darwinian sense is not simply a scientific theory, it is a fact. And then they would also say, hey, I'm very intrigued by this hypothesis that maybe we live in a giant simulation. And so my modest point is, there is a high tension between those two statements. And yet, as it became evident in my arguing with the people in the wake of my perhaps reckless tweet, a lot of them didn't even get what my point was. Like, you know what I mean? It wasn't like, oh yeah, I can see what, but see the subtle blah, blah, blah. No, they were just like, what are you talking about? So that's, anyway, I'm happy to take this wherever you want, Adam.
Yeah, your points are often misunderstood, but they're always hilarious. I'd like to first point out that you scrolling through Twitter is about as innocent as a Crip or a Blood doing a real slow drive-by through enemy territory. I mean, you knew what you were all about when you picked up the phone. Yeah, I thought.
And actually, that you're right, because it's not like I'm just like I really am.
You're
looking for targets,
looking for gang signs. Yeah. I thought it was a fascinating exchange. We'll get into some of the specifics maybe. But first of all, obviously, to the extent that you think this might be a simulation, you can't simultaneously think that evolution is a slam dunk, because how in the world would you know anything about the base reality? You'd have no context to look at it or think about it or anything, and you wouldn't even really know much about what the simulation was all about. You wouldn't have any context. You'd just be making a bunch of assumptions. And oh boy, in the comment thread that ensued, a whole bunch of assumptions were being made about what the nature of this hypothetical simulation was. And before we dive into that, I hope you'll let me tell you my own specific bugaboo about simulation theory. We've covered a little bit in a previous episode. We'll link to that. But I am just annoyed as heck by Nick Bostrom and Elon Musk, who say all these sorts of things. Well, I'll quote Elon. He says, quote, "There's a 1,000,000,000 to 1 chance that we're living in base reality." And I think that's just goofy. And this is from a guy who likes the simulation hypothesis. I think it's fun. It's fun to think about. It's occasionally comforting in the way that, Christians who aren't that serious about it are probably comforted by the idea of heaven or whatever. It's nice to think that, hey, maybe this world isn't the end, but that it's a high probability, it's nuts. Their argument.
Go ahead. I was going to summarize what I understood their argument to be when the last time we got into this, but yeah, go ahead. I don't want to.
Yeah, their argument is that our species just has a predilection for creating false environments. See every video game ever made and etc. And then point B is something like our technology is always evolving, so that therefore we will eventually, our species, get to the point where we can create a simulation that is completely indistinguishable from whatever base reality is from the perspective of people in the simulation. And then, since time is infinite, blah, 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 what are the chances that we happen to be existing in that tiny percentage of the period of time before these simulations began to be populating the universe? So it's trillions to one that we're living in a simulation. And that is all just a cute idea, except you don't even have one data point for a simulation that is indistinguishable from base reality from the perspective of people in it. We don't even know if such a thing is possible. It's just pure conjecture. And from such a flimsy set of...
Can I stop you for a second? Let me just hammer home. I want people to get, like, if you kind of just go with the flow, the appeal of that argument, because it is kind of interesting. Like, picture Star Trek The Next Generation. I like to go to that as an example. It was from a time of my life when I was perhaps happier, more sheltered, who knows. Things were simpler. And they had the holodeck, right? And people do simulations. They go in and you can fight people, or, Riker would go on a date or something. Who knows what would happen in that place. And so the point was, clearly we can all agree that humans at some point, I mean, perhaps already, but they will make more and more realistic simulations of things, right? Yep. And so the idea is that doesn't seem like a controversial claim.
For sure.
And so then the idea is, okay, so at any given point right now in the universe, are you saying you're sure there aren't simulations going on, right? And the only way the argument goes, I'm kind of like flipping it to say that there aren't, is you'd have to have very strong probabilities on, like, the probability that an advanced enough species that could create simulations would just refrain from doing so. You would have to have a very high percentage on that claim, which seems like a weird thing to say, or to say that no, the chance that humans are the only advanced species in the whole universe is such and such, and most people wouldn't want to sit. So the idea was, once you let something in the door by saying that, yeah, even if there's just a 1% chance that there's other aliens out there, and that there's a 1% chance that if they had this sufficient technology, they would go ahead and make simulations and blah blah blah. Then all of a sudden you get to the point where it seems unavoidable that of all the things that think they're alive, the overwhelming majority of them would be in some simulation somewhere. And so then, given that we think we're alive, what are the chances that we really, so that's the way it works, that the only way you can rule out, like through Bayesian probability, that we probably are in a simulation is if you have what seems to be unrealistically strident assumptions that prevent that from getting in the door. Because otherwise,
it's not like I haven't tested the theory too. I mean, every time I enter a new room, I shout out "computer arch," and the darn thing just never appears. So I know. Really. I mean, I'm like I said, I'm tempted by the idea that we could create such a thing. It's just we've literally never done. For all we know, it's not a thing that's doable. I mean, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but. I mean, it could be that Agent Smith was right, and the human mind just rejects every simulation that you inject it into, and it finds a way to wake up out of it. We don't know.
So there's that. I think another huge assumption that we're not really sure about is, I mean, does Harry Potter think he's alive? Does Luke Skywalker, really think that, oh yeah, that was crazy when I found out my father was Darth Vader, or is there a sense in which you say, no, those aren't real, like that, just they don't feel anything. And me talking to Siri, telling me which way to turn or something, is Siri really trying to help me, or is that more just, it gives the appearance of having a conversation? So again, and with this stuff, we're brushing up against deep philosophical things, the Turing test or whatever you want to say. But I'm just saying that is something that they kind of assume that, oh yeah, in the simulations, the things feel like they're alive and they're looking around in the simulation that we create. And I said, well, that's kind of a big leap right there, that there are plenty of people that would just deny that at the outset and say, no, they wouldn't think that.
It is funny, given how much these large language models have gotten really good. Heck, even Siri on your phone, to look at what we're dealing with right now with technology and go back to Moriarty on the Star Trek Next Generation holodeck. Like, he was a real person or an actor, but, in the genre of the show or, in the plot, it was really compelling that this computer simulation intelligence wanted to live. It sure convinced me that it was an alive thing.
And even that was interesting, right? How many layers, like it was a fictional television show in which they had a simulation that brought to life a character from a fictional thing from the real world, because Moriarty, from Sherlock Holmes. So
one of the reasons I really like to think about simulation theory is just to keep my brain lubricated enough so that just in case in a couple of years I wake up in a pod with a cable attached to the back of my head, I won't be super freaked out. I'll be like, okay, all right, we had some room in our epistemology, our vision of the nature of the universe that I can adjust. Same.
It's also interesting too, just is that the people watching us right now, like, we're not in your computer or your phone, but they think there are, you know what I mean? Technically, how do they know? They've just seen some photons and vibrating air, and they associate all those sensory observations with, oh no, there really is an Adam Haman and Bob Murphy out there.
And as good as Grok is, they could have simulated a podcast like this.
Yeah.
But yeah, strictly speaking, that's just not how odds works. You're living in the world of the hypothetical. It's a hypothesis that these things can be created, a simulation that from inside, you can't just take off the Oculus visor and realize, oh yeah, that was fiction and this is real. And we should have a bunch of humility about stuff like this because we don't even understand the nature of our own consciousness. We don't, strictly speaking, understand how time works or gravity or the nature of the universe. And so for people to just casually say it's billions to one or whatever, trillions to one, that we live in a simulation, it's like, slow down, okay? You've moved away from neat idea that's fun to think about to just, you're bad epistemology. Bad.
And there's also something, let me see if I can distill this down into a coherent statement, and then you give me your reaction, Adam. I understand where they're coming from. Like I read through was it Bostrom? Is that the guy's name? I skimmed it, or I may have read the Wikipedia, full confession. I do my...
Tell the truth, Bob.
My simulation theory the same way I do my Israel-Palestine.
Yeah, tell the truth. All you really did is hover your mouse over that thing in Wikipedia, and you read the little pop-up box.
Right. And so I understood the art, but the way it works is something like, oh, here's a chain of, here's a probability of this and probability of this, and then when you multiply them all together, and then this pop, and I understand the constituents and the framework and the general logic of the argument, and then if you set the argument up that way, out pops this result that billions to one or whatever Elon says. But at the same time, then you want to say, okay, but what's your confidence that you framed the problem correctly?
Right.
And then I want to say, not very. You know what I mean? And this reminds me, I think I brought this up when we did the episode on this stuff, but just to refresh people's memory, there's this thing called a Boltzmann brain, and it's loosely based on something, it's the kind of thing with a telephone game that the way philosophers and scientists talk about it now might not be what this guy Boltzmann originally proposed. But in any event, the way it's used now in common parlance is the idea that in quantum theory, there's nothing really preventing any particular state of the universe. Like there could be this particular quantum state, and maybe it's very low probability, And so the idea is there could just be, boom, a possible universe that just has one star in it, and that's it. And then there could be another possible universe that's got 60 quadrillion galaxies and blah, blah, blah. And there's all these permutations. And then there are also possible universes that consist of a human, what we would call a human nervous system that has all sorts of memories encoded in it, the way, a quote, real human nervous system has memories and, conscious experience. And you say, well, but is there oxygen? Well, no, it doesn't need to. It just flashes into existence for like a millisecond, just long enough to have one conscious experience. And it has this whole memory and everything, boom, 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 boom. And for that fleeting instant, it thinks it's on this thing called Earth, and it has a history. Oh, I know who my parents are. I know where I went to high school and this and that. And geez, I'm worried about paying my bills and blah, blah, blah. But really, no, it just pops into existence through the quantum foam for one, whatever, millisecond, and then disappears again. And the equations of, quantum mechanics are consistent with that being possible. And then the deal is, once you admit that, oops, now, well, that could have, there's a possible. And so then once you allow that into the door, then you say, well, so given that you now just had a conscious experience, what are the chances that it was, quote, real and you weren't just a Boltzmann brain that just, but you know what I mean? And it ends up in this weird thing. And then one last thing I'll say here, one thing that was interesting is the way this YouTube video that I watched on it tried to escape from it. It kind of said, well, if that's true, then we have no reason to believe in the quantum electrodynamics and blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? Like, we find it compelling and there's all this experimental verification, but that's all just gobbledygook, right? No, there is no prior history. It was never tested. It was just, we think it was, and we just popped into existence. And so then it's like, well, the very foundations upon which we produce this hypothesis crumble once you go down this path. So it's kind of got to be self-defeating, right? And that's just because that was very analogous to an argument C.S. Lewis made about evolution. And, well, what reason do I have to suppose my senses and my reasoning capabilities and believing in Darwin's theory if he actually were correct, right? And so whether you think C.S. Lewis's application is right, I thought that was an interesting parallel. But in any event, all this simulation stuff and whatever, and sounds like that. And I think people look at it, say, yeah, I can't point to whatever line in the proof is wrong, but come on, that can't be right. That's crazy.
Yeah, I avoid going crazy with that Boltzmann brain thing by just saying that either we don't really understand what's going on at the quantum level that makes people think that's what the theory predicts, or that there's a scaling problem. It just doesn't, something about that doesn't work right when you get out of the subatomic and start putting all the atoms together into something like a person or a planet or a star. But it does, in the course of that argument you were having on X, it was fascinating. People were already just ready to go to the mattresses over arguing that evolution is a fact, gosh darn it, not a very well-supported hypothesis or the best theory available, which I think it is. But they were just they'd gotten themselves into fact land so much that when you pointed out hilariously that, yeah, they also believe, at least in some percentage in the simulation theory, that they were all ready to defend this weird other set of certainties about the nature of the simulation, like what it would be like. A lot of them insisted the simulation must have run from the Big Bang on with a perfect physics model inside it, such that the stars formed and galaxies formed and evolution happened. When strictly speaking, you wouldn't know anything about the simulation. You didn't code it. You just are having an experience and you're wondering if it's real or not, or whether it was simulated. And as you said in that thread, as ephemeral as human consciousness is, the simulation could have started 18 seconds ago. And you just thought you had a memory of the life you lived up until now. How do you know? But these people are just so adamant about, well, yeah, we could all be living in a brain in a vat, but evolution happened. Come on. What are you, one of these religious fanatics?
Right, yeah. So just to unpack some of that stuff. As Adam's saying, folks, one type of rebuttal to me that was to say, no, Bob, even if on the very grounds of simulation theory, like in terms of the serious scientists who have proposed it's been around for a long time. The simulation began billions of years ago. And so that's, it's effectively the same, like within the simulation, yeah, evolution is a fact. I'd just like to say, what color the sun is yellow. And you want to say, no, it's not really to simulate. Well, okay, but you get what we mean. We're saying in the simulation, and likewise, right? So there was that move. And then as Adam is saying, one way I tried to respond to that was like, what are you talking about? The simulation could have started 18 seconds ago. Just like you go to read a novel and it's not tens of thousands of pages long. It just picks up the action and, New York exists and London exists, and it's, there's a whole backstory that's assumed when the simulated characters of the novel begin. And likewise, there's nothing preventing that. And another thing too that would happen that was kind of funny.
Before you move on real quick,
yeah.
More than one person, when you brought up that, the simulation could have started 18 seconds ago, they so missed the point that their response was, well, yeah, but from the Big Bang on, it could have just been running really, really fast. So all that happened in 18 seconds.
I didn't even see that. That's even worse.
Yes. I mean, they're so wedded to the preconceived notion of what this artificial hypothetical simulation must be like that was their solution to, it could have started 18 seconds ago.
Yeah. So folks, to give it an example, just make sure you're getting that in the beginning, like some people just, they literally didn't understand what I was even getting at. Like, what are we talking about? And so I said, okay, well, like in the movie The Matrix, do you see why it would be a problem to say that Agent Smith was derived from, a single-celled organism billions of years ago? Like, you see how to say, he came from that, it would just be false. Like, there's no way you could say that's a true statement. And then people, because I was saying stuff like, there could be, for all we know, cells don't exist. You know what I mean? In the simulation, they do, right? And so in the movie The Matrix, it happened to be that the, quote, real world did have many characteristics that The Matrix simulated. But still, that's why I picked the Agent Smith one, because clearly he wasn't a real person in the real world somewhere. He was just, the simulation generated him. And then in response to that, a lot of people were like, oh, Bob, that's just sci-fi. That's not what simulation theory is. But, well, right. But again, it could be, right? The Matrix, we can't prove that we're not in the Matrix, you know what I mean? So you can't, in order for you to say evolution is a fact, you would have to say it is a fact that we are not in a simulation as depicted in the Matrix. Right. And I want to say, how could anybody say that? It's a fact. You're 100% sure we're not in a movie like the Matrix, like so I think it's implausible. I don't think we're all hooked up to a cord in a vat in a machine, but I can't, I'm not going to go around saying it's absolutely impossible.
Yeah, it seems like a bit of a long shot, but definitely one of the things that it's conceivable. I mean, I think we've talked about certainty a lot in many of our crossover episodes, and I think you shouldn't be that certain about a lot of things. And I think there's a lot of epistemological hygiene in just being open to a lot of different possibilities that haven't been, excluded as a function of our current level of technology, scientific understanding, and there's so much more that we don't know that we know. Yeah, especially about the way people think and read and act on Twitter.
So maybe just to push this a bit, is it worthwhile? Because in fairness, when I was, in my mind, just easily with eyes closed, my weak hand hitting the ball back over the net with these people. Like one person said something about, it's true in the simulation. And so then I wrote back, okay, so do you think Italian plumbers can shoot fireballs out of their hand underwater depending on their diet? Right, because Super Mario if he eats the right kind of mushrooms. Or flowers. I guess you got to eat the mushroom to get big, and then you got to eat the flower to get the fireballs. And at some point, I realized, like, okay, maybe I'm being a bit unfair because I think for my points to all go through flawlessly, I have to basically be saying there's no such thing as facts except possibly like geometric proofs and stuff like that. But that ultimately, so in other words, when I want to say evolution is a theory, it can't be a fact because, hey, for all we know, we could be in a simulation, and so what does it mean to say Abraham Lincoln was not alive in the year 1900? Is that a fact? And I think a lot of people would say, yes, that's a fact. It's not just my theory. No, it is an absolute fact that Abraham Lincoln was not, the guy we mean by Abraham Lincoln, the famous one, was not alive in the year 1900. And then, I could say, well, for one thing, there could be simulation. We don't even know if there was such a person. That could all have just been a computer program, subroutine or something. So there's that level. But even less fanciful, perhaps, You could say, well, I mean, there could have been aliens that came and kept him alive, rushed him to a hideout after he got shot and kept him alive, and then there was a fake body, double that historians thought was the dead one, and maybe he really is still alive somewhere, and he's been kept alive through advanced technology, right? So, and I realized, like, okay, there's a sense in which maybe I'm just playing a word game if that's all I mean. So I do mean it more substantively, and we can, maybe we should get into that in a minute, but you get what I'm saying? Like, there's a sense in which if I pushed it really hard, just about nothing is a fact.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. And a thought just occurred to me that maybe I should just use a hammer instead of whatever I've been using before. Once you've accepted the possibility that we live in a simulation, you have to accept the possibility that there's no such thing as evolution, because there's no such thing as living creatures made out of blood and bone and flesh.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what if the simulation was created by completely digital beings who just created this fun little game where they can go inside and pretend to be people, humans, these bipedal, hairless monkeys, and they like to race cars and have cocktails and go to dinner and look into the camera and have podcasts. But strictly speaking, you know nothing, not only about the nature of your own simulation, but what the baseline world actually is. Maybe there was never molecular life or biological life. So, and then if you're saying that, yeah, but in the sim, evolution's a thing, I'm like, come on. That's not how, coding would work. Like, not only does there not have to be a past for evolution to have occurred, it's like if you go out in your backyard with a shovel and start digging, and if you found something, that wasn't there until you started digging, right? Why would the computer be using resources to put something there until you went to discover it? Do you think they're actually going to backfill an entire jillions of years for single-celled organisms to evolve into it's ridiculous. Come on, use your head. Once you're in a simulation, just slow down about deep historical facts.
Right. So a bunch there. So one quick thing I want to make sure I don't lose sight of in what you just said is it right? That move that some of them were making is to say, okay, Bob, fine. We get your point that maybe our conscious experience and the history of the universe that we perceive in this simulation, I get why you'd say evolution isn't true in this realm or dimension or whatever you want to call it, plane of existence. Yeah. But there must have been beings that created the simulation, and they obviously evolved. And so I said, okay, if you're going to make that move, though, at least do me a favor and stop pretending you're being empirical. But no, it's just you can sit in your armchair and logically deduce evolution must have happened because, number one, I'm sure there's not a God, at least the way he is depicted, by Christians or whatever. And so there's not special creation. And then number two, it had, conscious beings exist. And three, they must have emerged from unconscious things. And so four, something like the Darwinian story has to be true because that's the only possible explanation. The very fact that we're sitting around here wondering where did life come from means Darwin's basically right. And, no one would say it exactly as glibly as I just did, but a lot of them, that's clearly what's driving it. When they say things like you say, well, the beings that created the simulation, they came about through evolution. Well, how do you know? Exactly. How do you possibly know? Or at least, okay, so just admit that it's, as a priori as Austrian economics is. Stop thinking you were being empirical. And man, these Bible thumpers refuse to even just confront the evidence.
Yeah, it's like I was alluding to earlier. The funniest thing about the way people talk about the simulation is all the certainty they have about the characteristics of it. Like they imagine this big multiplayer online game, when all of us are players in it. But, strictly speaking, how do you know the whole thing isn't just designed for you and you're the only, this is pure solipsism. You're the actual only real person and the video game was made for you. And Bob sure talks a lot and he seems real smart, but maybe he's not even real. And, insisting on the nature. Yeah. Anyway, I keep banging on the whole point too much, but once you I don't think the simulation is a very plausible idea. I think it's a fun one. And I treat it as that, a fun one. I do think that by all observable accounts, evolution is the most likely scenario for how we ended up looking like this. Could be wrong. It's, a theory that's lasted a while, but we don't know everything about how it works. There's that whole how in the world do we pack so much information into these tiny, tiny organisms?
Great.
And there's,
Yep.
I mean, we've talked about this before. There are chinks in the armor, that are either things that our knowledge will fill in, or things that'll blow up that entire theory, and something else will have to replace it. There's plenty of room for doubt. But the way this whole conversation started, just being so dead certain that evolution is real, and either admitting like a 20% chance that we're in a simulation, or like Elon thinking, no, it's a darn near certainty that we're in one, and thinking evolution has to be true. That doesn't mix.
Great. So you sort of just walked right up to one of the things I have jotted down here is topics to pursue. So why don't we go ahead and run this? I do want to circle back and get back to this fact versus theory thing, but I don't want to lose the train of thought that you just opened up. So I am sympathetic. I get what the people mean when they're saying, well, come on, aren't there, like, okay, so let's say we're in a simulation, and however it works, it appears that there are certain, there's a parsimonious set of rules that govern the transformation of matter and energy in this simulation. Now, maybe they, quote, aren't real. Okay, fine. But, on this plane or whatever, in this version of experience or observational phenomena, it seems that they obey these rules. And so what does it mean in the grand scheme to say that, evolution happened according to the rules in the simulation, but it's not real? So I get how they're putting their finger, but what's interesting about all that is precisely the method of attack coming from the intelligent design camp. Okay, so just real quickly here, but again, it's critical, it kind of underlies the whole thing, and why I wasn't just having fun, that I actually don't think evolution, as propounded by the standard atheist scientist, is correct, or at least I think it has certain shortcomings. And in particular, it's the idea that, there's just blind mutation acted upon by natural selection, and that's what explains everything. And so the intelligent design people, like, for example, Michael Behe, who's his signature concept is irreducible complexity, he is fine with everything coming from a single cell, right? The theory of common descent, I guess, would be the specific claim, right? So he's not against that. It's not that he thinks God over the course of 6 days created all the different kinds and the different lineages, and that, a plant can't turn into a zebra. What are you talking about? Like, that's not his deal at all. And he's one of the giants in the intelligent design camp. His thing, though, is to say that first cell was like a supercell. It had all kinds of information and blueprints packed into it, and there's no way it just absorbed that from the dumb external environment. Like, so yes, if you think every living thing today has a common ancestor, sure, but that still doesn't explain, well, why the heck did the universe happen to be such that it allowed for the formation? So notice that is exactly consistent with thinking we're in a simulation. It's just most ID people would think we're like in the mind of God. So yeah, God's telling himself a story, if you will, and he made up some parameters and blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of, consistent with my worldview. But again, the point is the problems I have with standard Darwinian stories of evolution is that they don't have that informational content. And so you notice that that's exactly the kind of thing. So in other words, how could we come to believe we are in a simulation and this isn't the base layer? It would be observing things like telltale signs of a creator, right? An intelligent being that, wait a minute, if this was just spontaneous and, quote, random and mindless, why would the universe be like such and such, right? So that's what I'm saying. So it's kind of interesting how they all kind of do fit together. And I don't necessarily have a problem with the people who are saying, come on, Bob, within the context of the simulation, evolution happened. And I would say, right, if what you mean is right now we're at state, time step 3072, and if you just keep going backwards, taking the rules of how time goes forward and goes backwards, then when it starts, and this all fits, yep, granted, but then the idea, well, but why do the rules work like that? And where did this come from? Like, that all sort of, raises the question that, yeah, this doesn't seem like it was just, well, who knows why, but there's no conscious being or simulator. So, okay. I was going along for a bit there. Any thoughts?
Just a couple. I mean, in the Matrix, they have a very stable physics engine, and it's all very predictable until you see the black cat twice, and the programmers decide to insert something new, completely breaking the the physics engine, and Neo can break it. That's why he can fly, because it's all made up and not quote unquote the real world. The other thing, as soon as we start talking about evolution and biology, we very quickly run up to the edge of where I understand things. But did you see somewhere in all your intellectual musings the theory that it's not necessarily blind mutation? Because blind mutation, it seems like we wouldn't have anywhere near enough time, right? But I thought that some people were arguing fairly recently that there's excellent reason to think that the mutations wouldn't be blind. Running through all the various conceivable permutations of a mutation, but it being like, got one eye half open, searching through a like you'd be more. I'm totally butchering the example, but there would be more likely that the mutation would change skin color than have another hand pop out of your forehead or something like that.
Right.
Those are ridiculously preposterous examples. But what I mean is that over the course of time, the mutation would be more likely to occur into a certain set of spaces and preclude other ones, if they were seeking something that was more likely to help it.
Right.
Or something like that.
Yeah. So what I do have from recent experience that overlaps what you're saying there is, and I'll link to this, folks. I had this guy, Jonathan Bartlett, on the Bob Murphy show, I don't know, 2 years ago or something at this point. And he's a contributor to the intelligent design movement. And he's coming like from a statistics angle. He's like a math guy, computer science math guy. And that's one of the things that he expounds upon, is to say, even within standard biology, they don't rely purely on random mutations. And the specific example he walked through in the episode was your immune system. And so I'm not going to get the details all right here. I'll try to just keep it, high level. But the idea being that the standard explanation from anybody in terms of how your immune system, like, oh yeah, you get some foreign pathogen in your system, and then, your immune system runs through a bunch of different, it keeps changing things to try to, until it finally hits the antibody that fits the lock, or the key fits the lock, blah, blah, blah. And then it, blows the thing up. But his point was, it's not that your heart starts going through a bunch of mutations to say, well, maybe this will help fight off. You know what I mean? Like
right.
Yeah, it engages in a bunch of mutations and tries various things, but it's very tightly constrained to say, like, what we're going to randomize, but we're going to do it in a very constrained manner. We're not just going to let it rip, because then you're going to die. And so he was just taking that, which is a well-known feature, obviously, that any standard Darwinian biologist would say, well, yeah, of course we know that's how the immune system works. But Jonathan tried to run with it and just kind of show. So see, even on their own terms, things are a lot more orderly, and like, oh, there's a higher purpose that's being served here. So to explain that feature, you would have to say, oh, there actually were historically humans that when exposed to a new pathogen, their heart would try all kinds of stuff. And well, maybe if we start, pumping, let's freeze the pathogen by not circulating the blood, that'll show it. Oops, and they all died out, and so you can do it, but it's kind of just like with all this stuff, it just pushes the problem one layer away. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, you see how stuff works, and it seems like, oh, that's very orderly, and it looks like there was an intelligent being behind this design, and then you say, no, it couldn't be. But to explain, well, how did it get like this? You'd say, well, there could have been all this other stuff. And again, it's like you run out of time. That's really the thing with a lot of this stuff, folks. It's you can challenge it and say, but a lot of the objections are just saying, for this to have happened, even according to the story, like where they do admit it's got to be blind mutation that natural selection then works upon, you start doing the numbers and it'd be like, oh yeah, if you had 16 quadrillion years, maybe this would pop out, but we don't have that much time to work with. And then the defenders of the orthodox view will just say, basically, well, we must not be framing it correctly because we know this had to be the answer, because we know the universe is about this old. We know we don't believe in God, Genesis, or at least for methodological reasons, we can't cite that as an example. And so therefore this story has to work, and we must not be framing it correctly if it looks like the numbers don't add up.
Yeah, I don't think the objections blow up evolution, but it does mean we can't just dig your heels in the sand and say, yeah, this is it, and this is all we need to know. I mean, you have to look for, like, evolution, if it's true, and I think it is notoriously conservative. You know, that's why your heart doesn't turn into Iceman or something. You know, like you grow concussive laser beams start popping out of your eyeballs because, you know, in one generation because of mutation. But I do think there's a lot of pieces to it, if it's true, that are not understood. And I think the blind mutation is probably one of them. I think there's probably a reason to suspect that organisms, it's not just blind mutation that makes the change, that it's directed in some intelligent-ish way. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a divine, you know, guiding hand. It could be something else that's more bottom up than top down. It just means we have to keep looking for it.
Just to go off on that, right? And so I think with a lot of this stuff, the people from both sides, you know, if they're, I'm trying to put it, it wouldn't surprise me if it turned out that what actually happened and where humans really came from, if we all saw things, that just about every camp would say, oh, a lot of what I was really sure about actually wasn't right, either, you know, a little bit off or, wow, I was totally wrong. But you can still see a sliver of truth in what I was saying, and so my opponents were all wrong too, right? And so, for example, like I said, it wouldn't shock me. You know, I'm not committed to that, you know, that there was a 6 days of 24 hours each that God created each. You know, I mean, I'm open like Behe is to it all came from a single cell. And then maybe it's allegorical when God was creating the different things, you know, so let there be this, like, you know, he was programming that into the way the universe would unfold or something. But what I am saying is what you're saying there, Adam, about like, oh, the blind mutations, maybe they weren't, that if we saw film of what actually happened, it could be, oh yeah, these, you know, these amino acids are just floating around and they come together and form this folding thing and blah, blah, blah. Wow. And it would be like, what are the chances that would have happened? Like, that was a miracle, right? And so it wouldn't be that the laws of physics were violated, but it just would have been astonishing. Like, you would not have thought that would pop out of the inputs, and yet it did. And so then the atheist could say, well, we just got lucky. And the Christians would say, that's the hand of God right there. What more do you need?
Right. Yeah, we do have a tendency to see the patterns that we want to see and just reinforce our own opinions, you know, fit whatever evidence comes through into our own model. It's a feature and a bug. If I ever do wake up in the vat and unplug the cord from the back of my head, I sure hope a bunch of people aren't there just shaking their heads going, God damn, we gave you all these fields and mountains and rivers and oceans, and you just sat in that chair and did that podcast over and over and over. You're an idiot.
I sometimes when I am, like if I'm sitting there scrolling Twitter or something, you know, I'm like, I should have gone to bed 45 minutes ago. What am I doing? And then I will catch myself like, okay, given that I stayed up, why wasn't I learning about things or doing something? Instead, I'm sitting there arguing with people about what James Lindsay said. I can't argue with him directly because he blocked me, but still, you know, it's
because you had one in the chamber and you were slowly cruising down the neighborhood of the rival gang, Bob. That's what you were doing.
Okay,
so,
are you all right if we hit this issue? Okay, so in your mind, like, at what point is there a fact versus a theory? And this also came up. I remember one time it was on like some email list, and Gene Callahan was talking about his approach to history, and that, you know, ultimately it's a sort of spurious distinction between facts and theories. That, you know, some theories are far more established. And there were other professional historians in the thread that were just like, what are you talking about? And I understood what his point was, right? So the idea being that, you know, all we have right now are artifacts, and we can have diaries and journals, and we have all sorts of time. We got photographs perhaps of things, but ultimately, like, do we really know there was a Julius Caesar? We you know what I mean? That we sort of sometimes slip into this thing, or, oh no, we're absolutely sure Abraham Lincoln was shot on this date. But technically, you know, it could all be a ruse, and the aliens could be playing a trick, and we could be in a simulation. You know what I mean? And I don't just mean going back forever. I mean that the simulation started in what we call the year 1950. That could happen. And then everything, you know, at that point, all the evidence and historical records were just boom, came into existence at that point. Just like in, you know, in Star Trek, when they say, go ahead, I want to go back to London, 1837, blah, 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 New Year's Eve. And they go in there. No, the simulation just started, even though everybody in that world, and there's old buildings in the simulation, but they're not really old. They were just created, So anyway, how do you feel? But you get the point that there is a sense in which there's just about nothing is actually a fact. It's all theories. Like I just, I have all the sensory data and I have a theory that there's a tree that's 100 yards away and photons are bouncing off, but technically I'm just having sensory experiences. For all I know, that I'm not seeing it. There is no such thing as a tree.
Yeah, I mean, I think about these epistemological issues all the time, and as you might guess, I'm pretty stingy with the word fact.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't believe it's justified to think that we live in a simulation, but I leave it open as one of many hypotheses. And since that's the case, what in the world am I going to say a fact is? So I look at these things on a sliding scale. There are some things I'm more confident in than others, but I could be wrong about any of it. I mean, again, I could wake up in the pod and the thing in the back of my head, and then what did I think a fact was? On the other hand, I do look both ways before I cross the street and think that it's meaningful. So obviously, I think I'm checking for something that is true in the real world that's going to keep me from getting plastered by a Chrysler. So I think proper epistemology is to be humble, and just understand that you're going to have to act in a world where you live in the world of incomplete information. I spent 30 years as a professional poker player. I'm very, very confident making big decisions for important money on not that much information. And I think life is like that. You have to gather in as much information as you can, not information, sensory input as you can, and grapple with it intelligently, and then make a bunch of decisions about how you're going to live your life. But what exactly is a fact? I'm predisposed to not use that word or use it colloquially. It's a fact that the earth revolves around the sun and whatnot, and rotates on its axis. It's a fact that we have but one moon, and it's called Luna, assuming it is. I don't know.
So all right. Is it a fact or a theory that you have to know when to hold them and know when to fold them?
Every single thing that Kenny Rogers said, including his beautiful chicken recipe, is a fact.
But Robert Redford is wrong when he says sometimes you have to fold with a winning hand so that you can win with a losing hand.
I can only assume he was bluffing the screenwriter in that movie.
Yes, where he was trying to impress that girl and
impress that chick. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, those Cuban girls will fall for anything. I mean, Cuban people in general fall.
In general, they make a good sandwich, though.
Okay, so joking aside, I want to pull this through a little bit more. For example, just to make sure people are getting where I'm coming from, because again, there's a danger where I'm being too cute when I say, "Hey, evolution." You're saying evolution is a fact, not a theory. Well, I mean, we could be in a simulation, and I can see I was like, "Okay, yeah, sure, Bob, whatever, fair enough." But I do mean it's my criticism is stronger than, and also putting aside my stuff about intelligent design and all that. I have seen people say, and I don't just mean like casual people on the internet. I think like, for example, there was a guy, I forget the guy's name, but when I was hip deep in the intelligent design debate, I was reading books, so there was Darwin on trial by some guy that was like a lawyer. And then there was the defense, and the guy's title he gave it was Science on Trial. Okay, so in the very title, he was equating the theory of evolution with science, right? So that is that, I don't think this is a particularly unbiased approach, but in any event, and I think it was in that book, I might be conflating, but there definitely were scientists that I saw when, ID was big and they were trying to like, hey, let's teach the controversy in the schools, like in the mid 2000s when this was really hot in terms of the culture wars in America. And they were saying things like, oh, these ID people are these special creationist Christian Bible thumpers. They'll say stuff like evolution is just a theory, which some of them admittedly were saying. And, I understand why a biologist would bristle at that because it makes it sound like, hey, it's just a theory. Well, but then they would say it's a theory, just like the theory of gravity. And I always thought that was ludicrous. That for one thing, the theory of gravity has changed, right? Like Newton's theory of gravity was supplanted by Einstein's, and right now they're trying to unify
and it will
quantum
change
mechanics.
Again.
Right, yeah,
so we know for sure is it will change again.
Right. So people, but physicists will kind of admit that our general relativity can't be the full story because, at the quantum level, it breaks down, right? So there's a sense in which it's not fully correct, right? So there is that element, but also usually what they mean, if you just mean like, well, yeah, but we know when you throw a ball up, it's going to come down. And you say, well, unless you throw it up really fast, then it could keep going, right? So even there, a lot of what people would throw out when you say, what do you mean when you say gravity, is a fact, not merely a theory? And, and you could see it'd be pretty attenuated. But again,
the way
we know that way more than all the cells emerged from a single thing 4 billion years ago or whatever this number is. You know what I mean? Sure. Like it's crazy to say those in the same zip code as, oh yeah, they're theories of the same caliber.
Yeah, there are greater and lesser piles of evidence supporting some theories as opposed to others. And using just words like fact and theory, and then that's the end of the analysis, just these words. That's not accurate enough. That's not in detail enough. And the way I usually frame this, at least in my mind, is that the theory that we think of as quote unquote facts is just the best one with a ton of information that we're the most confident in. But strictly speaking, in my epistemology, they're all theories. There's some that we just have more confidence in than others. And the gravity one is really unique because I think since we don't have a unified understanding of physics and the cosmos and how these things work, we're just certain that much like Einstein supplanted Newton, something's going to come along and supplant Einstein. Maybe it's this quantum gravity concept they're noodling with. Maybe it'll be something completely different. And I think you're going to be much less anxious about knowledge if you just use things as placeholders until we know more. We're not omniscient. There's very little that we just know 100%. We're a very new species with a very small brain, and we're doing pretty good for these senses that lie to us. I mean, good luck us. Our eyes and our ears literally deceive us. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, your mental framework literally changes what you see and hear, at least on the margin. I'll put a link in the show notes to all the stuff that supplants these crazy assertions of mine. But my general predisposition is just to be a lot more cautious. It keeps you from tangling yourself up in knots when crazy economists come by and say, hey, nice theory about evolution. What about the simulation hypothesis?
Exactly. And there's a lot of other stuff that economists say is crazy too. But yeah, just to give one more example to make sure, because I know that some people are just going to settle into two different camps and be like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. You, Murphy, you want to believe in your creation stuff, and we over here believing in evolution, and it's kind of because we have to. Okay, fine, whatever. But I'm so sure that my worldview is basically right, and yours is nutty that I'm not losing sleep over that. Okay. But to show you that there really are problems, unfortunately, I was just trying to do a quick Google, and I can't think of maybe you know the guy. There's at least one prominent atheist scientist who, at some point concluded, and he believed in what's called panspermia, that he thought aliens must have seeded life on Earth because he could, as the evidence in his mind piled up to show the standard Darwinian story it couldn't just be that given what you had to work with on Earth, it's, sunlight and whatever, possibly asteroids hitting it and whatnot, that in his mind, no, we cannot tell a plausible story of how life could have emerged. And so he thought it's intelligent aliens must have evolved elsewhere through some mechanism where it made more sense. And I can't tell you because I haven't looked at their bodies. I don't know. But they then in the lab created the cells that then shot a probe or something to Earth, and that's where it came from, right? It's because he was an atheist.
Yeah, the scientist you're thinking about is Ridley Scott, who made Alien, the franchise, and Prometheus. I'm kidding, Bob. It's a movie, where the alien came down and seeded life on Earth, and also made.
It's funny because I was going to say, no, I'm sure that's not the name. That doesn't, like, I've heard that name, but no, that's not what I'm talking about yet. And I didn't know if you were kidding because, like, how Michael Crichton actually, was pretty well informed, then wrote some stuff. So I didn't know, like, oh, Ridley Scott, was he actually a trained? I didn't know that.
No.
I mean, if you could be a comedian and then talk about geopolitics, you can certainly be a scientist and then go into movie making.
Only if you've ever actually been there. So have we run this into the ground? Before we go on, if we do, I think this is an episode that the show notes will be particularly interesting. So go to bobmurphyshow.com and check out the show notes there, or go to hamannature.substack.com for the show notes on my end, and also on the video description of the YouTube, Haman Nature. There are going to be some good links to some articles and previous episodes we've done that will either fill in some of the gaps on things we've been saying or just irritate you further about how stupid we are. One of those two. Or something
else.
What's
interesting is technically the folks at home won't know if we really did record those things in the past, because right now, what evidence, we just have links and there could be video where, but you don't know that was, quote, done in the past. We could have just created it all 18 seconds ago.
It's on demand. This is a universe on demand in a bottle. Something like that. Any final words of wisdom, Dr. Murphy?
I think we've demonstrated that this episode was not intelligently designed.
Guilty. All right, this was fun, Bob. Thank you very much, as always. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for either watching The Bob Murphy Show or listening and watching to Haman Nature. We'll catch you next time.
So long, folks. And remember, watch out for those Italian plumbers if they've just eaten the plant.
It's fire. Fire!